I feel like more than once on this podcast, I've brought up the meme of like things men will do before they go to therapy, but it does seem pretty applicable.
Welcome to 1999, the podcast. I'm John Brooks.
And I'm Julia Sermons.
And everything's fine. Everything's fine in America. Everything's good. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to stick in the past because why not? And today we're doing something a little different. We are discussing a movie that just barely makes the cut as a 1999 movie, but was suggested by our guest, who we'll talk more about momentarily. But it's a movie that appears nowhere in the 1999 box office charts, mainly because it only screened once in Los Angeles on October the 22nd, thanks in no small part to some Vince McMahon fuckery. Though it did get a limited release in March of 2000, directed by Barry Blaustein, an accomplished comedy screenwriter who used to write for SNL, and whose screen credits include 4 Police Academy sequels and a bunch of Eddie Murphy hits, including both Coming to America movies, both Nutty Professor movies, 1992's Boomerang, and 2005's The Honeymooners, starring Cedric the Entertainer and Mike Epps, the less about which said the better, featuring the real-life stories of wrestling legends Terry Funk, Mick Foley, and Jake the Snake Roberts. Today we are talking about the now beloved documentary Beyond the Mat.
It's all supposed to be fun.
The Rock is the most electrifying man in sports entertainment today.
It's not supposed to be real.
You're not gonna be scared, right?
It's gonna be okay.
You can go back to the future. You can do anything, right?
But behind the scenes, it's a whole different story.
I hope everyone feels like they got their money's worth out there.
And for the first time ever, you'll know the real truth.
He's gonna puke! He's gonna puke! He's gonna puke!
It is showtime.
The hard facts.
Really worried about him as far as his health.
You need a new knee now.
She's gonna live here the rest of her life probably and have 7 kids and 7 husbands, and she'll always remember tonight, man.
The family pain.
You make it sound like you don't even want to live.
There's times I know. There's a lot of times I know.
The real danger.
Shut up!
I'm a very violent person, and I'll hurt you. So I get paid to do what I'm doing. That's like with any entertainer.
Come face to face with the wrestling world the way it's never been seen before.
Gave up Wall Street for.
Wall Street wasn't fun. Wrestling is fun.
It's still hard after all these years.
I just don't want to hurt no more.
This is the dance.
Beyond the Mat.
I think we touched a lot of people, if you don't mind me saying.
So, Julia, what's Beyond the Mat about?
In Beyond the Mat, director and wrestling superfan Barry Blaustein makes a case for professional wrestling as a legitimate form of entertainment. He starts at the top with a look at the World Wrestling Federation, headed by impresario Vince McMahon. Remember that name. The WWF is like a movie studio with carefully choreographed battles, tight scripts, and carefully designed costumes and soundtracks. We meet McMahon. He has a lizard brain sense of what the public wants, including a character who can projectile vomit at will. Naturally, this wrestler will be named Puke. Blaustein takes us on a tour of wrestling stars and hangers-on, from an oily dude running a 2-bit training camp to the beloved champion Terry Funk, who's considering retirement. The philosophical Mick Foley, who wrestles under the name Mankind, contemplates what it means to have such a high pain tolerance and worries about how to explain his career to his children. Washed-up showman Jake the Snake Roberts, in almost unbearable sequences, confronts some of the wreckage that his career has wreaked on his personal life. In the climactic Royal Rumble, Foley goes up against a fellow named The Rock. Remember that name? Foley's children are thoroughly traumatized as The Rock beats him to a bloody pulp. Foley ends the film sorting through his conflicting feelings about his profession.
Beyond the Mat received a mostly favorable critical response with an 82% Rotten Tomato rating and a Metacritic score of 73. And the Christian Science monitor David Starrett, whose Metacritic score is 100, wrote, "Stay far, far away unless you can handle the copious amounts of blood and agonizing psychological problems that its participants face on what seems like a daily basis." In similarly high praise review for Variety, Robert Kohler wrote, quote, 3 years of cross-country filming covering everything from the penthouse to basement of this gladiator wing of showbiz is economically compressed into a heart-rending look at the pain behind wrestling's kitsch. The clash of contemplative filming and tough physical athletes battling demons in and out of uniforms links Beyond the Mat with Hoop Dreams, especially when Blaustein, a screenwriter who helped create several of Eddie Murphy's characters for Saturday Night Live, trains his tiny camera on the down-and-outs, wannabes, and washouts of wrestling. And for Chicago Reader, Lisa Allspector wrote, quote, "Documentaries are almost always more interesting if the filmmakers fess up about their relationship to the subject, as unabashed pro wrestling fan Barry Blaustein does in this naively made, compelling homage to the sport." Other critics to praise the movie included Roger Ebert, Jay Carr, Lou Lemonick, and A.O. Scott, but Lisa Schwartzbaum in Entertainment Weekly was more measured in her praise, writing, quote, "Beyond the Mat is entirely dependent on and shaped by the quote-unquote good stuff the director happens to get, rather than driven by hard questions a journalist might want answered. Beyond the Mat often has a rambling feeling of a home movie Blaustein made for his buddies, with the director himself narrating puckishly as if to say, hey, get a load of this bit. Here's a cool soundbite from Jesse Ventura." The former pro wrestler and current governor of Minnesota observes, probably not for the first time, that politics is way more cutthroat than wrestling. But Blaustein's accommodating, non-judgmental approach serves him well when he sidles up to the wives and children who love these guys and who accept that part of loving them is watching blood gush. So joining us to talk about it is author and journalist Ross Benesch, whose next book, 1999, The Year Low Culture Conquered America and Kickstarted Our Bizarre Times, comes out in April. Ross, welcome to 1999, the podcast.
It's good to be here, and it's good to talk about Beyond the Mat.
Thank you for recommending this. This has been one of those movies that the name has been dropped to me for a long time, and I won't speak for Julia, but I'm pretty sure also true for Julia, I'm not a wrestling fan. It is not something that has ever just sunk into my pop culture diet. But I did definitely find this movie fascinating.
Well, it came out at the right time. So this is when wrestling peaked. So even if you weren't into wrestling at 1999, you couldn't escape it. You mentioned Jesse Ventura was governor. WWE became a public company that year. So that's the year Vince McMahon officially became a billionaire. The 30 million people watched pro wrestling on cable television each week. They had the two top shows on cable. All those wrestlers were on magazine covers, on talk shows, on sitcoms. It was never as big. It was bigger then than it's ever been. Bigger than Hulkamania, bigger than it is now. And Beyond the Mat gave us the first raw look. There's been other imitators since, but man, you see Jake the Snake smoking crack, in rundown motels. That wasn't ever really shown in a wrestling documentary before then. I don't know if that type of footage was shown in a sports documentary in general.
Yeah.
I sort of have a couple ways through a weird period where I listened to a lot of talk radio, and then also through friends where I realized there's a large gay male following for professional wrestling. So I kind of had those inroads into it, but in 1999, I definitely heard, "Do you smell what The Rock is cooking?" at school constantly.
Oh yeah, because he was a brand, he was probably in 12 TV commercials at the time that you would have saw whether you're watching a sitcom or a movie or something that wasn't wrestling. About the gay fans, there was a documentary recently made about the wrestler Chris Colt, who was gay, but he was mostly in the closet to the public, but he was out to like his close friends, and like that was a huge part of Chris Colt's appeal. He did very homoerotic stuff. He actually ended up doing porn after he got out of wrestling. But for those who are interested in that subculture, look up that guy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also know, I mean, that 99 was the year that SmackDown began on UPN, a no longer in existence network that is now merged with WB to be the CW. But like, yeah, and I think they still have. Isn't SmackDown like still on CW? Is that
so? SmackDown's rights have changed a few times. They are going to USA Network now. So they were on Fox after they were on, after Viacom lost it, they eventually went to Fox. And now USA just lost Raw, the Monday program. That's the flagship program. That's on Netflix now. But USA still wanted to do business with WWE. So they got like the second show, which is SmackDown.
It was interesting to me because like I definitely remember so when I was in college in 99, and I remember like a lot of my friends who were like wrestling fans, like the PlayStation games were big, and this is when I first like learned about The Rock. And The Rock, like, I think is the kind of the character that I consider to be the one who like transitions from the WWF era to the WWE era, right? And like there's this really like this shift in, it feels like, the way that wrestling was kind of marketed and its sort of place in culture. Because growing up in like the 80s and 90s, like Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake Roberts and like Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret the Hitman Hart, and like those characters, I knew those characters like in the background of my like cultural world. I never watched wrestling, but like I played the Super Nintendo games, so like I obviously like I know Mick Foley as like an adult because I think he's rad. I didn't really know him as like a child, but like Jake the Snake was someone I was like, oh, I know who this is. And then kind of watching that story unfold, I was like, oh, oh, also it's the wrestler. Like, okay, I see what's happening here. But it's really fascinating because I never really realized that like, the sort of like 98, 99 era was like the period of time where like the sort of WWE of my youth and the or F of my youth and the WWE of now like happened, right? Like that's when that sort of, when Vince McMahon kind of made that shift into like a new audience and new territory.
Yeah, he switched to the Attitude Era. He cut a promo in the late 90s about how like Hulk Hogan saying children should take their vitamins and say their prayers is passe. Now we're going to have the Godfather talking about pimping hoes and bloodletting and Stone Cold chugging beers and, all this racy stuff.
Yeah. And it was like weirdly more, it was, again, I didn't like think about this sort of consciously until the sort of Jake the Snake Roberts element of this movie, but like it was like more athletic in like the late 90s, early 2000s, right? Where like the guys were like the wrestlers were like more in shape. There was less about the sort of like, I don't know, the sort of flashy makeup-y, big haired characters, and more these kind of like badass, right? You had like The Rock and Sting and like Stone Cold and Edge and those kind of guys, right? There was a whole, the aesthetic of it was very different as well, it felt like.
Yeah, less superhero-y. Like the 80s was probably the peak of the steroids, because you had like that scandal hadn't gotten to court yet. So it was just so rampant. Like you look at the Ultimate Warrior's physique. That's not a natural physique. Like you don't care how much weights you lift. You're not going to look like that. There's still steroids in the 90s, but I don't think to the excess that they were in the 80s. And a lot of guys were using their real names. It was like to be more real, especially in WCW. Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, those are their legal names. Those were like some of the biggest stars of the era, rather than like, Papa Shango or Warrior. In the 80s, it was very much, a cartoony superhero sort of vibe. and
Mhm.
it's probably continue to shift that way toward a little bit more realism, more athleticism, especially in the women's ranks now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Beyond the Mat doesn't get into that so much, though. It's really focused on like guys who can't give it up despite their bodies just being broken.
I feel like more than once on this podcast, I've brought up the meme of like things men will do before they go to therapy, but it does seem pretty applicable here.
Yeah, that you could have inserted that meme in a lot of places in this documentary, especially with Terry Funk and Jake
And
Roberts.
Jake Roberts. Yeah. 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 And what I think is interesting is that the reason what I really liked about this documentary, in terms of like the way that these three stories kind of intertwine, is that Mick Foley does kind of seem like a standout. Like his story is a little bit different in that he really can endure a lot of pain, and like he maybe wasn't quite as like broken and battered as these other two people were, and he didn't quite have like he really did want to do this his entire life. He kind of grew up with it. But
They're also
his
interviewing him at the peak of his career too.
right, but his sort of tension, or his sort of like conflict, was really about his kids and his family, and that he really is kind of this family man. Like I like that with each of these three different subjects, it's not kind of all the same kind of trauma and the same kind of story. There's overlap between a lot of them, but like also very distinct differences between the three of them as well, which I think makes it sort of like more than just a sort of this kind of life will ruin you and you'll destroy your body, and it's all based on the fact that you were like a child of the rape of a 13-year-old girl from a dad who never loved you. It's like it's not all bleak.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
Well, and people come from all different backgrounds who do this. Like Jake the Snake, his dad was a famous pro wrestler, and he was sexually abused and physically abused as a kid. I mean, he had a lot of baggage before he went into pro wrestling, and that probably, I mean, he ended up going on an even darker path on pro wrestling, and
Yeah.
almost killed himself a few times. I mean, he was in really really bad shape. Mick Foley like grew up in a loving household in the Long Island. He's still friends with his dad. Like
Yeah.
he's with his kids every day. Like Jake Roberts doesn't talk to his kids. Mick Foley retired like before he got too beat up, and he's made millions of dollars and has a nice successful life. The Rock is in that documentary. He's like the top star in Hollywood now. So yeah, it really is all over the board.
It was kind of interesting to me that he comes in only at the end and as this kind of like a bit player in the movie, given like his prominence at the time. It's like, is he just too sane, for lack of a better word, to like make it into the doc?
I wonder if he was just harder to get access to because he was so big. Like Mick Foley, you'd have to ask the director, but I wonder if like Mick Foley is chosen, and The Rock, kind of excluded because Mick Foley's more willing to give him 40 hours of interviews, and like The Rock probably like sat backstage with him one day and cut that. I don't know. That's just speculation. The Rock was already starting to appear, in movies and TV shows by '99. He was in Star Trek, Voyager.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. I think the next year was when he was in the Mummy. He had the Scorpion King role. So
yeah, that would have been 2000. So because the first one was 99, the sequel was 2001 or 2.
Okay, so I guess a few years off, but
yeah,
he was so big in wrestling.
Yeah.
It would be great though to follow The Rock more, because at that point he wasn't really known as much in the way he is now to non-wrestling fans.
Yeah, it's interesting that like I don't think he's the only one, but Mick Foley says, like, well, what else am I going to do? Like he feels like maybe he should quit, but like, what else am I going to do? And I was sort of wondering about like how, given how The Rock was able to transition into this kind of second phase of his career, like kind of what other options people have found if they're not just addicted to getting beaten up.
Some of the
Minnesota
options are kind of
governor.
bleak. Oh yeah, Minnesota governor. Yeah,
That's one of them. Secretary of Education. Well, that's whatever.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that stuck out to me too, Julia. Like it's one of those things where we hear this a lot from even like NFL players. It's like when it's over, so many NFL players, for instance, like end up, homeless, right? Because like, yeah, you dropped out of college to go do this thing, and like, now what else do you do? But yeah, there is something because, of course, it is so taxing and so damaging to the body, but also like so addictive, and also there's just nothing else like it. Like there isn't something that's like similar to this that you can then go do. I suppose like training wrestlers is probably your best option. But like when they show Terry what's his name? What's his last
Terry
name?
Funk.
Terry Funk. When they show Terry Funk his x-rays, and he's like, you have no knee left. And he's like, all right, well, what if I don't get surgery? It's like, no. Like, you shouldn't be able to walk anymore. And I'm like feeling that pain. And he's like, yeah, all right, I guess I'll wrestle for a couple more years then, and then see how that goes. And his wife's like, no. I'm like, what the, like, that is really effective to me because, you can kind of say that these people have a kind of like pathological addiction to this. But when you show it with this guy who's like a fairly, pretty like level-headed guy, honestly, Terry Funk, but like,
Also has a family who loves him.
Yeah, he's like pretty well adjusted.
He's not broke. I don't think he needs the money.
No, but he's just like, all right, well, what if I don't fix my knees? And it's like, man, that seems to. A doctor told me that. I'm like, get me in surgery right now. Like, give me some new fucking knees. That's horrifying. But
really see how much they love it. Like,
yeah, I just thought that was a really effective little like moment to keep in because it illustrates that point really, really well.
And Terry Funk isn't doing this for WWE at the time, so like he has seen everything in his career. Like he has been at the top. He even wrestled in the territorial days before his dad was a huge wrestler and a huge promoter. So the Funks are well known even before WWE became well known, and he's like an elderly man at this point, probably qualifying for Social Security or damn near qualifying for it. And he's doing it for ECW, which is like a startup at the time. He's not, he's doing barbed wire matches, bleeding all over the damn place, risking not being able to walk. But it's not like he's the main event of WrestleMania. He's like doing like 1,500 people at a convention hall in Philadelphia at that age. Like he's just that addicted. It's a lot like The Wrestler, the movie, the Aronofsky movie. Like they just, despite all the reasons why you shouldn't, the thrill of the crowd and the pageantry and the attention you get, once those guys are in it, they can't get out of it. At least the NFL, because it's not scripted. Like when you're 50, you're just not good enough to make the NFL. I don't give a shit if you're Jerry Rice. Like, but these guys can go forever.
Yeah, the ECW storyline was also kind of interesting to me because, like, I did find it fascinating that it's not a surprise exactly, but like how much the WWF was like an old Hollywood studio system. Like everything is done in house, and and that like McMahon also conceives of it that way. He says we make movies, and like it's kind of wondering like what McMahon's favorite movies were or anything. But
WWE Studios made they made some movies that weren't even wrestling themed, but they would like star a wrestler. I think they made that Marine movie with John Cena.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
I mean they were used as vehicles for their stars, but they weren't like Ready to Rumble or something. They weren't about wrestling necessarily. I don't even know if they still do that.
But yeah, and then the ECW, you have this kind of like group of scrappers, and you have this like very intense, kind of weird fan base, and like just seeing them, like the way you can transition to the big time with like trying to get the pay-per-view special off the ground, and that like there's this kind of like, I don't want to say like underbelly, but there are these like second tiers of
totally
of the sport that like nevertheless have have good people, I guess, and also have like fans who identify themselves as being the scrappers, maybe. And like that's a very powerful allure.
It's almost like indie rock, like if like a people following a band that's not super huge, that's very DIY with their marketing, and then like WWE is like you're with Sony Music playing stadiums. Like it's just so many different levels to this stuff. But there's still, I mean, ECW had talent in the '90s, as much as like any other promotion. Like they developed so many guys that became WWF Hall of Famers eventually, but they had to like risk breaking their necks and making no money in Philadelphia for a while before they would get that bump.
Yeah, I found also like the thing about the ECW thing about it, which it's one of the elements of kind of the world that I hadn't appreciated before, and kind of in line with what you're saying about 50-year-old football players or whatever, is that with the sort of with the WWE /F sort of system, then there's more kind of like there's more protections there for you, right? They don't want their stars to be like mauled and injured and like beaten to a bloody pulp. But as you get older, right, you have to subject yourself to like more visceral, violent assaults, right, and like more danger, because you don't have the flash and the flare anymore. And so like when you are Terry Funk, or when you are like Jake the Snake Roberts, right, or even like Mick Foley, who's somewhere in the middle there, right, is this idea of like, if you want to stay in the game, then you have to up your sort of willingness to be bloodied up. And there aren't going to be like, the ECW isn't interested in like preserving your body. They're interested in like sacrificing it for these bloodthirsty teenagers who love that shit. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, you could definitely burn out quicker there. But with WWF, you have more protections if you're a star, like The Rock. But if you're what they call a jobber, you're talent enhancement. You're there to get your ass kicked by The Rock or Hulk Hogan or whoever. Well, yeah, you're on a contract with a short leash, and those guys are independent contractors with no health insurance or benefits, but they still aren't allowed to work for competitors. So you have to exclusively work for WWF still to this day, not have them give you anything, and still be barred from going to a competitor. It's kind of crazy what they're allowed to do to their labor force.
Yeah, there's like a lot of like, one of the things that I found really interesting about this film as a film is that like, I'm not sure that it's a great documentary, because like a great documentary was made so much that it kind of lucked itself into like accidentally revealing a lot of really interesting stuff, right? Because by being just sort of like, here's this guy who loves professional wrestling, and he's a longtime producer and writer, and he like brought his camera with him for 3 years and interviewed these people, and like the stuff just materializes. And it's like, one of the really incredible sort of moments that I had was I forget who the name of the guy who runs the wrestling school is, right?
Yeah,
like he reminds me of Macronus from like Gladiator 2, right? I'm like, or like whoever Oliver Reed plays in the Gladiator 1. It's like, it's the same thing. It's like this guy who like trains up, like finds these warriors and like trains them up and then brings them to the Emperor, and is like, think these guys can make prime time, think these guys could be in the call. I'm like, what the fuck? This is the same thing we were doing 2,000 years ago. Like, it's just, there's no differences here really basically whatsoever. And I just like, it's one of those, like, the more things change, the more they stay the same moments for me. I was like, this is wild to think about it that way.
Wrestling schools are very strange. I spent a week in 2014 at a wrestling school in Brooklyn writing an article for Deadspin.
Cool.
Yeah. The wrestler who ran it was Johnny Rodz.
Okay.
He's a WWF Hall of Famer, but he was like 75 years old by the time I interviewed him. It was in Gold's Gym, like where like LaMotta and all these boxers trained.
Yeah,
it was
sure.
really run down though. It was in downtown Brooklyn, and that's like Johnny Rod's made a whole career just bringing guys to Vince McMahon. Probably one of like 30 guys who come to him to do this, and they have to pay him to do it. You have to pay to go to wrestling school. That's how Rods makes money. Like you, all these guys are paying their dues, but then like Taz or Tommy Dreamer are guys who he trained who made it in ECW and then they make it in WWF. So he's just finding like teenagers a lot of times who want to do this. One girl I talked to was 15 and her mom had to sign all her waivers. And it's a weird, I don't like, unless if you are a pro wrestler yourself, I don't know how you get into being a wrestling school instructor. Like it's a weird business model. It's so niche.
The guy in this one seems kind of like a flim flam Harold Hill type character.
Yeah. I think Johnny Rodz is more legit than this guy. Like Johnny Rodz was a wrestler himself and had guys come out. That's why I interviewed him. Now this guy, he didn't seem like he knew how to run a business. Like he didn't just seem that with it.
Yeah, except he did know how to get the money. So, I don't care about your credit checks, your credit score, whatever. You got to give me my money.
Yeah, they talk to those indie guys, and like the amount of sums they take home from a show is so depressing.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if you cover gas with like $50.
Yeah, but again, I think like that sort of thing is important because it is it's a way of demonstrating to an audience who wouldn't necessarily know otherwise that like everybody who winds up in sort of professional wrestling on the WWE like scale has like really 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 wants to do it. Like I don't know of any, there's probably a few, but I don't know of any real instances of like a guy who just like someone found because they were doing something else and just got like hoisted directly into the WWE.
There's a few instances,
right? I'm sure there are, but like the majority of them, like this is their story. Like even if like the Rock's story, like it's very similar, right, to this sort of thing, like where he talks about sort of like sleeping on like a mattress that they found in the dumpster, right? Like all that sort of thing. This is a very like
I think The Rock's embellishing though. He had a leg up on 99.9% of the population with his dad and his grandfather wrestling for the McMahons. But but the guys who don't have family ties, oh my god, yeah, you gotta love it. Every once in a while you get someone who's lucky, like Bill Goldberg got lucky. He kind of lucked into wrestling after his football career ended, and he just had the look, and he got pushed to the top, and he didn't give a shit about wrestling. Was it Jake Paul or Logan Paul's wrestling right now? Like they recruited him because he was so famous on YouTube. Sure. He didn't have to go through years but like the guys who weren't NFL players, who didn't have a dad who's a Hall of Famer or aren't social media famous today now, they get shit on for years.
Yeah, well, Logan Paul too. It's like, well, people want to see him get the shit kicked out of him.
True.
That's where I really felt the moment when I felt like McMahon is this kind of like bizarre, scummy genius, where he's like putting himself in the ring, and like who do you want to see beat up more than the boss?
Oh yeah, brilliant strategy to make himself the heel of the 90s because he's such an unlikable man in real life.
Yeah, and like more so than we knew now. Like the other thing I found really interesting about like this movie is that I was like, oh, this is like right before people understood the depths of how fucking awful Vince McMahon actually is and like the extent of his crimes. And I wasn't sure sort of where those revelations kind of were in the historical timeline, and going into this movie exactly like what kind of Vince McMahon we'd be seeing. The one that we see is like, oh, like it's all so obvious. It's also there. And it's also kind of disturbing the way he's like able to kind of, there's that sense of a very kind of abusive sort of megalomaniacal personality, and this like effortless charm that he's always just able to kind of like laugh at himself just enough that he disarms that sense of like menace that he constantly brings. I mean, for sure the guy is a genius of a kind that there aren't very many, but like he's a very specific sort of genius. But like absolutely, this thing that he did and this thing that he does, like he has a very particular and unequaled talent for whatever that thing is. I mean, like when he shows up as the bad guy, I'm like, God, that's perfect. Like it's just perfect. Like the look of it, like everything about it is just absolutely perfect. The steroid fucking body that he had,
Yeah.
like it's so good.
Yeah, he knew what he was doing. He when this was made in 99, wrestling fans were like aware he's pretty crummy.
Yeah.
Like he just fucked over so many people that he's done business with, and there were allegations of abusive behavior, but there wasn't as much publicly known as there is now, certainly. And I don't know if there was anything as like disturbing as what's come out in the last year, but then given how many times he's like knowingly screwed over people and mistreated people, when you hear it, you're like, well, it's actually not surprising at all. Like,
Yeah.
you believe he did all these depraved things. In the movie, one of the things he does there's two things he does beyond the mat that are pretty fucked up. One is just a minor scene in the movie where he brings in Draws, who's known as Puke, and he like just basically like he's just on his case until he throws up in a trash can, and then he's like screaming. He's like so happy he got this guy to vomit on a trash can on command. And by the way, Draws later in 1999 got paralyzed for life.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like a footnote at the very end of the documentary. But the other thing that's fucked up is it's just one of 100,000 things he's done in his life where he's backstabbed and gone back on business deals and violated contracts of all sorts. Is Beyond the Mat. You mentioned this earlier where like it had a limited release. One of the things they were relying on is to promote Beyond the Mat during WWF Raw. Like
right.
who is the like there's not a better place to advertise for an audience to watch this documentary than on WWF programming. And McMahon agreed to that when they agreed to do all these interviews,
right,
and be featured in the documentary. And then like he saw like a cut, and it wasn't like this propaganda. Like WWE produces their own documentaries about all their stars and their history, and they're very like, it's like North Korean state media shit. Like the way they talk about themselves is just not believable. Beyond the Mat is like a guy with his own viewpoint that is not working for the company. McMahon wanted to assert editorial control. He offered to buy the rights to Beyond the Mat. He's probably going to kill it. The filmmaker refused. He probably lost money on this. McMahon probably would have given him more money than he made releasing this kind of small scale documentary. And then McMahon's final thing was, well, if you can't buy the rights, he just won't. You can't air ads for this during Raw, and that really reduced the chance of this documentary to catch its audience.
Can we go back to John's comment about sort of how much this is like intentionally or kind of just luckily interesting documentary? Because I did, when you were reading Liza Schwartzbaum's comments, I kind of agreed with a lot of them, that like the idea that his way of inserting himself into the documentary, kind of, I guess with the exception of some of the moments he has with Jake the Snake, I don't know how well it served the documentary. And I felt like it was like he felt this need to justify it as a subject in a way that I don't, at least me as a fan of documentaries, like, this is an interesting subculture. I want to learn more about it. But it just felt a little off to me at times.
Yeah, it felt kind of amateurish sometimes. Like it just didn't have a lot to add other than like you're inserting a first person perspective here. But he doesn't have that interesting of a first person perspective. Like he wasn't really involved in the business. He's just like a fan who made a movie about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also found it weird. It's like that he was like, I was ashamed to, and I'm like, you wrote 4 Police Academy movies. Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, are you afraid of not getting invited to like the Met Gala? Like, what are we talking about here exactly? I don't know. I found that pretty comical. Yeah, I sort of oscillate between like this is actually a really great documentary, or like it's accidentally a great documentary, or I don't know, the sort of messiness of it is part of what sort of makes it great, that it is a little bit amateurish. I do know, like I was reading that Blaustein, part of sort of the conflict with McMahon was a little bit his fault, and a part of it, especially with Jake the Snake Roberts, there was some messiness there, I guess, and I wasn't entirely like thrilled with the way that Blaustein dealt with it. That I guess he told Jake the Snake Roberts that it was going to be like an educational movie for kids, and it's not. And
that's a weird claim to make.
It is, and I don't know how much this is Jake Roberts, like, sort of, because Blaustein is basically like that's not true, and he has some problems, which
Jake
is true.
The Snake
like,
was also high the whole time.
Yeah. Which, like, objectively, like that's not untrue, but like, Blaustein was basically like, well, I wish him well, and it's like, okay, I don't know, this is weird. So that's kind of a bummer, but like, I don't know who to really like believe there, obviously, but yeah, I thought that was weird.
It is kind of like one of the big questions for documentary filmmakers about ethics is just like, do you interfere in a situation like that, or do you let it unfold as if you weren't there? And like the way it's portrayed in the movie, which I guess could be altered to some extent or massaged, is that he calls him and he's already high, and so I don't know if that gives him any leeway or not, but it is it's so uncomfortable. Basically his whole storyline is just so uncomfortable. And I mean, I think his daughter just seems like incredibly emotionally intelligent and aware of like what's going on, and like what can kind of separate herself from it and accept that she's not going to get what she needs from her father anytime soon. And I think, like, were she not so self-possessed and intelligent in that way, I think like that those scenes could have felt really kind of like icky.
In the Rustler movie, Mickey Rourke's daughter is kind of that same type of character.
Right. Yeah. And she's like quoting Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's a very like interesting kind of stark contrast between them. And I also think like one of the things that makes me think like, well, this might be more of a Jake Roberts issue than it is a Blaustein issue, is that, like he had Blaustein carried on a very good relationship with Mick Foley. And Mick Foley was like heavily involved with, doing promotion for the film and like appearing with him in interviews and all that sort of thing. And, Mick Foley was like not high at all during the movie. So, on zero amounts of crack. And I will also say like one of the things that I'm very grateful for this movie is that I've always like, I love Mick Foley, and like this made me love him so much more than I could ever imagine. Like, I just like, what a fucking awesome dude he is. And just like fascinating, just like incredible character. And
I love his Santa Claus documentary.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, and I mean, he writes books, and like it's like he clearly like found what to do after wrestling. That proved to actually not be that much of a problem. But like, yeah, he's awesome.
Mick Foley's autobiography was the #1 nonfiction hardcover book at the very end of 1999.
Oh, there you go.
Well.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, he's a really intelligent guy, and I don't think he probably had help, but I don't think it was ghostwritten. I mean, I really think that was him doing that. He's just smart, and he has a perception of things that a lot of people don't when they're in that business.
I do remember like being freaked out by Mankind as a kid, but like I'm over that now because of the whole like Leatherface motif, But.
Yeah, well, I think the warrior philosopher is like always a very appealing kind of like character archetype, and just like his like, I mean, so much of this movie is like about men and their like various relationships to pain, and he sort of is like trying to tease through the idea of like, okay, am I sort of addicted to the pain? Do I get something out of the pain, or am I just, is pain something I can really tolerate, and that's just part of this job that I do? And yeah, to see him kind of like parse those questions very thoughtfully was one of the most interesting parts of the film.
The scenes where his kid, like his daughter's like crying, watching him just get the shit beat out of him, and then they like juxtapose that to him like holding her and like running around their yard. I can't remember if it was Stand By Me that they play or My Girl. They play like one of those like
it's Stand By Me.
Stand By Me.
Yeah.
That was probably one of the better editing choices that I felt like he made in the documentary.
Fascinating thing about his daughter is that it turns out, if the question is what would Mick Foley look like as a little girl, and the answer is adorable, because she looks just like him and she's so cute. It's like, that is not something that I would expect.
God, she's probably my age now.
She must be. I was thinking about this. The other thing is like, Jake Roberts, I did the math, in this movie is like 2 years younger than I currently am.
Oh my God. He looks like he's going to die.
He does.
Yeah, he looks like he's... And
I'm like, man, wrestling and crack really put some age on a guy.
He's just still around though now.
He is, and
he turned his life around. Yeah, he turned his life around with the help of Diamond Dallas Page, another wrestler.
Yeah, a bunch of the wrestlers in this movie are now dead, which sucks. But
and that's common. Like the wrestlers dying before they're like 50. Man, it's way more common than it is in like any sport, and way more common than it is in the general population. Any of those guys who wrestled in the 80s and especially the early 90s, like damn near half of them don't make it much past 50.
Yeah. And like Terry Funk lived to a pretty good age, but yeah, he died last year, 2 years ago, fairly recently. The other thing that like I appreciated about this movie is, and I think a lot of like wrestling sort of documentaries or like behind the scenes things have kind of tried to like over amplify this, but like the way that it not only talked about performance as an element of like being a great wrestler, but also where I was like, oh, Jake Roberts was a really good actor. Like, like not just a great wrestler. When you see that opening, like they showed the monologue that he does right before they introduce his story, I was like, man, he's so good. Like the way that he is delivering this, the drama, the tension, the pacing of it, like he is a really like intelligent performer and actor. Like he would have been a really, really good like movie star. And that's such a huge part of what wrestling is. I mean, they talk about the Shakespearean element of it, right? Sort of openly in this movie as well. But I thought that the movie, again, like portrayed it and sort of demonstrated it without sort of hitting you over the head with it, as sometimes I think happens with wrestling documentaries.
I loved when right after he finishes that monologue, the dude interviewing him says, Longfellow couldn't have said it better.
Okay. So, and that moment to me, like, I remember that very specifically because I was like, that's the sort of thing, like when I was young, when I was like, 8 or 9 years old or whatever. And like WWF was on, like channel 38 on Sundays. And it was these guys, right? Jake the Snake and Hulk Hogan and like The Undertaker and all of those guys. I didn't get the tongue-in-cheek element of it, right? And when he said like the Wordsworth thing, I was like, God, that's funny. I was like, I think that's hilarious now, but how's like a 9-year-old going to understand that reference and like the deadpan way it's delivered? I just, the whole sort of like, satire performance of it just went way over my head when I was a kid. But it's, so like, yeah, it's always weird. Like, what is the who is this for element for wrestling was always a big thing for me. Cause I'm like, how old am I supposed to be? And, like, how am I supposed to kind of take this? But yeah, now I wish sort of adult me could appreciate that more. Cause goddamn, that was really funny.
I think the average wrestling age has doubled since
Yeah.
like the 90s. Like now it's like the average age is like us.
Yeah.
But there was still a lot of young people, like young adults, but mostly men watching it then. I don't think it was just the 10-year-olds. So there were some people who probably got that, although most of them probably not.
Yeah, I think there were. I think most of the people who, I mean, like, I think in the mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s sort of time, I think like, late middle school, sort of high school kids were really into it.
Yeah.
But but there was this like, Hulk Hogan was like on lunchboxes, right? And there was like WWF action figures were a big deal around that time. So there's this kind of like culture for younger kids, and yeah, but a lot of the humor and sort of the tongue-in-cheek elements were like completely lost on me, which I'm really kind of bummed about now.
Yeah. Well, at the wrestling's the demographic they've gone after, it's kind of waxed and waned because like the territorial days before as a TV product weren't just for kids. A lot of it was for grown men. Vince McMahon appealed to kids probably better than anyone when he made the cartoon characters like Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior and put them in a lunchbox. And then in the 90s, they got a ton of college kids. When they went to the Attitude Era, they got more college age viewers and fresh out of college than they like ever had. Like I remember the movie Road Trip, which the movie 2000 with Tom Green and Breckin Meyer. They that's like one of the things they bond over is they like talk about pro wrestling. They're like 24-year-old guys. That's like the big thing that they're into is pro wrestling. That wouldn't have made it as much sense 15 years earlier. And then now the audience is a little older. So it's kind of all over the map with different federations and different time periods.
Julie, did you have like any exposure to the pro wrestling world growing up?
Yeah, so as I briefly mentioned, I had this period where for unknown reasons, like when I was late to school, I would listen to talk radio.
Oh, right.
And there was a show called Ron and Fez. I don't know if this is like completely vanished into the ether. But Fez was, I think he was not out of the closet at the time, but he was kind of fairly queer coded in a way. And he was a big wrestling fan. And so I would hear a lot about kind of like the glory days wrestlers from him, like kind of out of context.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd have this kind of like, it was in my cultural soup somewhere. And then I went to college and I had this friend who was a gay man from Missouri who like had stacks and stacks of VHS tapes that we would watch together in like at 3 a.m. in the dorm lounge. And so I didn't really glom onto like specific performers or their arcs or anything like that. But I remember watching it with him and being like, this is really pretty fun.
Yeah, there were moments where I was like, wow, this is really gay coded.
It's very homoerotic stuff.
And speaking of which, like one of the things that I found really fascinating, would love to have had more time on, and especially now, because I think it's there's so much relevance to it now, is the China storyline.
And I talk about that in my book too, but go on.
Yeah, no, I'll let you talk about it. But I just thought that the way that she is talking about sort of expectations of femininity and the way that she had like jaw surgery and all this sort of thing, but also that she's like, I'm really smart and I just also like wrestling, and also I'm in really good shape, but I like dudes. It's like, sorry. And I'm like, wow, you should probably, tell this to the current presidential administration or something. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, what do you have to say about it in the book?
Well, in the book I have a chapter about pro wrestling is the ultimate like revisionist form of entertainment, and that sort of revisionism has bled into broader society. And one thing that they tell lies about is China. She was one of the biggest stars of the 90s. She was dating Triple H, who now is Vince McMahon's son-in-law, and he's one of the top executives in WWF. And with China in the 90s, she was so big. Like she won the Intercontinental Championship. Like that's not a woman's title. She would wrestle men and they would have her beat them. And I mean, she was as strong as anyone. I mean, she could probably lift and body slam a 300-pound guy. And she wasn't inducted in the Hall of Fame. She was removed from their video games. They kind of acted like she didn't exist for a long time. She did have a controversial career, like her relationship with Triple H obviously imploded, and he married Stephanie McMahon. She became erratic and made kind of unfounded accusations at a lot of people. She got heavily into drugs and depressed, and she died young. She did porn. Really sad life. It's a shame because she was such a talented star. Vice has a documentary on it. I think it's called Vice Versa, about China's life. You can find it online pretty easily. But to be such a star of that era, when you look at the other stars, they are they make documentaries about them. They're in the video games. They're in the Hall of Fame. They're company executives. And China, they just pretend like she doesn't exist.
Wow.
Even as they've reinvented women's wrestling now to be less about like flashy, sexy women, and they're more like physical and athletic now. In some ways, China was kind of a precursor to that. She wrestled a little stiff, like just like kind of brute strength, and didn't have some of the finesse and like ease that like some of the current stars have. But she had a huge impact on pro wrestling as a whole, and got the shit under the stick. It would be my way to put it.
Yeah, it's a bummer.
Yeah, it is. And it's now like after she's died, she's like Stephanie McMahon has said nice things about her, and they did put her in the Hall of Fame as part of DX, but not like as a solo performer. Okay. So she's back in the newest video game, so she's like slowly making her way back from like being deleted. WWF just deletes people when like Chris Benoit, they will never mention his name again. Like he's not on the website. For a long time, his matches were scrubbed, like on DVDs and streaming. You can at least watch his matches now. Because I mean, he was champion. Like it's weird to watch like an old WrestleMania and they just skip the Benoit match. And China's one of those people they do it to. And now the new one they do it to is Vince McMahon. The founder. He don't mention his name. If you search McMahon on their website, he doesn't come up. They like to act, when they find something that they want to distance themselves from, they act like it doesn't exist. But China, the biggest bullshit is they said she like had a controversial image, and they didn't, her name brought up like unsavory Google results. That's why she couldn't be in the Hall of Fame. Triple H said this, but like there are murderers and like con men and all sorts of terrible people in the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. So, including others who did porn. She wouldn't be the first one in the Hall of Fame who's appeared in porn.
I was gonna say that seems like a pretty permeable line.
Yeah.
In industries.
Yeah.
There's probably nothing as arbitrary as a Hall of Fame for a scripted sport.
Fair enough. It's a good point. Yeah.
They just kind of make up the rules as they go, and then they haven't treated her really fairly.
Unless you guys have anything else to say about the movie in particular, do you want to talk a little bit about your book before we start wrapping up?
I just have one point I wanted to make that was just this kind of a small little scene in the movie. That one indie wrestler was paying rent by picking up dead bodies for a funeral home. That was crazy.
Yeah. What's his name? Modest?
Yeah, Mike Modest. Like they had to the odd ends you have to do to make a living in that life before you make it big is wild.
Yeah. I completely forgotten about that point, but yes. And he did okay for himself, apparently. I was looking at that. The other guy, is it Tony something?
It was Tony's. I can't remember his name because he never really.
He also died last year in his 50s. So, giant bummer. Julie, anything else you want to?
Well, maybe this will come out in your discussion of your book, but I kind of wanted to like think about this era of the sport as like related to the rise of reality television at the time. And then maybe also, do we want to talk about the reverberations today, or
Do we
just
want to go to bed sad?
yeah?
Let's do it. Yeah. So what is the angle for this look at 99 in your book?
Well, the angle is just that the trashiest things from 99 are shaping our world now. Pro wrestling is one of many of those things. So like pro wrestling peaked in popularity in 99. Now kayfabe, that's the wrestling art of pretending that something's genuine when it's not, is like everywhere. Like it's certainly in our national politics. It's in the lies corporations tell us. Kayfabe, the wrestling concept, is like part of our lives now. And part of the reason it is that way is because wrestling helped popularize it in the 90s. Vince McMahon helped habituate people into believing things that aren't true. But then there's other aspects of trashy 99 culture, like reality television and talk shows, are certainly the way we react, certainly influence the way that people interact with each other online. So they also certainly are prevalent in our national politics. This chapter about Beanie Babies and how the craziness of collecting them and making a sector of the economy tank over this madness mania is present in NFTs and all these like crypto scams. They kind of have the same economic underpinning. And there's porn driving tech and free speech, and video games were scoffed at back in the 90s. They were like considered the devil and they needed to be censored, and they were the scapegoat of the time. And now they're the most financially viable medium there is. So what was considered trashy in the 90s is like in the White House now and on TV everywhere, and
quite
like in your
literally.
workplace. Yeah. So yeah, it's a little. Trump is the first WWE Hall of Famer to be elected president, and Linda McMahon, former CEO of WWF and basically a co-founder. She was the business mind. Like Vince is the creative mind. The successful business part of WWF is mostly done by Linda McMahon. She's a better business person than Vince is.
Yeah.
And now she's going to be secretary of education, which is
correct, because it's a
crazy.
meritocracy now. So if you have merit, then you get to do the job.
The thing I thought of actually was like when we were talking about McMahon making himself the heel and realizing people wanted to see him get beat up, like Trump could never have that capacity.
No.
Like his ego's far too fragile for him to like understand that like making himself the butt of the joke or making himself, look, quote unquote weak, that would actually benefit him in the long run. Like he's not that he's not that deep.
I mean, when he's appeared on WWE, you're right, and that's evident of his appearances in pro wrestling. So when they had the Battle of the Billionaires, and it was like Trump picked a wrestler, McMahon picked a wrestler, and the loser had to shave their head, like Trump wasn't going to lose. So like McMahon lost, and they shaved Vince McMahon's head. They had a storyline where Donald Trump purchased the WWF. He didn't actually purchase it, but that was the storyline, is that he's the owner. So whenever he's been in wrestling, it's always been like a flattering image, even though it's all fake bullshit. He only agrees to these storylines that like make him the business emperor.
Yeah. So Survivor starts in 97. We got Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is also 99. There's the rise of kind of the idea of like the primetime reality show. Do you think did wrestling benefit from the kind of reality show craze, or did it sort of shift to become itself more of a reality show and kind of fit in with that, right? Because it seems like the way that we're thinking about entertainment and television around this time, right, just sort of plays right into wrestling's hand a little bit, and it's almost the perfect opportunity for it to sort of reinvent itself that way.
It benefited from becoming more crass and having more money pumped into it. So like when McMahon decided the Attitude Era, and we're gonna do the Attitude Era, we're gonna make everything racy and really raunchy, that boosted ratings significantly. But that's kind of the same impetus that a lot of those reality shows had, especially the ones that were on cable television. At the time that it peaked in the 90s, though, WWF had more stiffer competition than it ever had. WCW actually beat it in the ratings for 83 weeks. And WCW had Ted Turner's money coming in. So there was like never more money spent on professional wrestling, especially the marketing of it, than there was at that time. And that competition was healthy. And it drove them to be more outrageous to get viewers. And it drove them to become a bigger part of pop culture. It's when WCW dies and bought by Vince McMahon, it becomes a real monopoly, that the wrestling ratings decline, and the show actually claws back. It becomes they enter the PG era. The Attitude Era did not last super long. They tamed everything down for television because it wasn't about just biggest reach at that point and beating your competition. They now had to appease advertisers, even if it meant fewer people, and they wanted to be more effective at marketing to kids again rather than just like 25-year-old guys. All this stuff, though, benefited from deregulation. Wrestling was deregulated in the 80s and 90s. Before, you used to have like a doctor there, and you had to pay athletic commission taxes. And Linda McMahon got them out of those regulations because their whole thing was it shouldn't be regulated like a sport like boxing because it's scripted, even though it's very dangerous. And when they admitted that it's fake, then like the storylines changed, and like you would see The Rock be Dwayne Johnson on Conan O'Brien, and then he'd be The Rock on TV. That before it was deregulated, the character and the person were never really allowed to be separate, even in their private lives. And reality TV, of course, benefits from a different type of deregulation, the repeal of the financial syndication rules. So when you got rid of FinCEN, suddenly broadcast networks could make their own primetime shows, and there weren't any of these separations between like a broadcast network and a movie studio and a like cable operator being owned by the same company. Everyone could do everything and make as much of their own content as they want. And so when you don't have to sell your primetime content or buy it from anyone else, and you can just make it yourself, the TV networks in the late 90s, because FinCEN was repealed in 93 and 94, that's when they go all in on reality TV in the late 90s. Before that, it was mostly a cable thing, and it wasn't repackaged and syndicated elsewhere like it was after the deregulation.
Do you feel like you have a sense of the fandom kind of, because like one of the first things Blaustein says in this film is like, he says like, everybody, the fans know it's fake, they know the storylines are scripted and the outcomes are predetermined, but that's part of the fun, or like everybody knows that, and it's just more about the spectacle. And like I kind of wondered about that because I used to think that about reality TV viewers as well.
Yeah.
And then Donald Trump was elected president. And so now I'm not so sure that the viewers are as savvy as I wanted to give them credit for. I don't know if you have a feeling about that in wrestling particularly.
Yeah. I mean, well, wrestling and reality TV both are, to your point, like altered versions of reality. And this might even be a sadder viewpoint. I believe that people know that reality TV and pro wrestling, and now in this case, presidential politics, are just a spectacle, that a lot of what's said isn't actually going to happen, or, or promises aren't going to be held.
Yeah, I think that's
and they
right.
still go for it anyways.
Right. Yeah.
Like they like the spectacle, even though they probably realize Trump is, playing a TV character when he talks about making Mexico build and pay for its own border wall. The fascination and entertainment aspect of it is appealing, even though it's fun when it's like lighthearted entertainment or kind of a pointless distraction in life. But that concept is kind of terrifying when it's taken to like the most powerful position in the United States.
Yeah, and there's also the angle of like, oh, well, he's just saying that. Like, he's...
Right.
That's the performance. Like, he's not actually going to do these terrible things.
Yeah, it's doing the like wrestler rant thing and being like, I'm gonna come after you. You know, it's like, and it can be written off that way. I think that's absolutely right. Right. It sounds like the guy before the match, like threatening the Undertaker. You know,
Yeah,
like,
all of his appearances sound like wrestling promos.
It's crazy.
Yeah, there was a photo. This is before Biden dropped out of the race, and Biden's like talking to the public, giving some address when you're still president, and Trump is on his plane watching the TV, and it's a photo of him like mean mugging the TV screen.
Yeah, another one.
And that's exactly what they do in fucking pro wrestling. Like, they like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart had a feud. Shawn Michaels would be in the ring talking about how Bret Hart's a coward and he's a sissy and all this. And then the camera would cut backstage and Bret Hart would just be like looking like, oh, I'm going to kick this guy's ass. I'm looking at him through the TV screen. Like, that was one way they would build the tension. And now that's what we do in the middle of a presidential debate. We use the same filming techniques that we saw on Raw 25 years ago.
Well, you know.
It's okay.
Wayne Johnson, 2028.
It's fine.
He'll probably be a Republican.
We're good.
We could do worse, for sure.
Yeah. No, Mick Foley. He's still one of our guys. Yeah, you know what I think is like really kind of interesting about 99 as a year beyond the movies is, and I'm looking forward to reading your book like for this, because I haven't really thought so much about sort of the more sort of tabloidy, trashy side of it and the way that culture has sort of manifested today. But what I do think is interesting is that like it is, as you point out, like the height of pro wrestling and like Jerry Springer and, you know, the Insane Clown Posse is also on the cover of your book, right? And that and the way that sort of manifested into like, you know, season 93 of The Bachelor or whatever, and here we all these years later. But then also at the same time, it's like also the year of the birth of prestige television with like The Sopranos and like The West Wing and everything that we know about like drama television today, you know, in the age of like Severance and like, you know, Succession is all starts there as well. So like the way that these two like very distinct branches and very like polar opposite branches of the way that we do sort of scripted media and entertainment, you know, really kind of are born here and just sort of like a straight line to where we are today is really interesting.
There's really a divergence. Like the high culture or the most critically acclaimed stuff was probably as good as it had ever been. Like Brian Rafferty's book about the movies in 1999 kicked ass. Clearly, I'm preaching to the choir on this one. Like, there's more great movies that year but then like, what was like the most watched show on television? Like on cable, it was pro wrestling. Daytime, it was Jerry Springer. So you had it was the best of the best, and it was there was also a lot of highlights of the lowlights.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to reading the book, and we're going to wrap up here. But before we go, we have to ask you our two questions. So you're a guy who is steeped in 1999, so this should not be hard for you to answer. What is your favorite movie of 1999?
I like The Matrix. It's probably a cliched answer, but I loved it as a kid, and I still like it. I watched it again like last year, and I was like, yeah, this is still kind of awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, you're not the first person to say it, and obviously it's like one of the iconic, you know, it's why our logo is Matrix inspired, and it's objectively a great movie. All right, so what's your favorite movie of all time?
Oh God, that's a tough one.
Yeah, you can make it up. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be real. You can
I feel like it changes.
Yeah,
but I really like Goodfellas. You know, that's another cliched answer for a 35-year-old man, but
fine answer.
Fuck, I love Goodfellas. I watched that again on my last. I'm gonna watch that again on my next paternity leave. It's one of those movies that like it'd come on like AMC, and it's like it's gonna be 3.5 hours of commercials. Fuck it, I'm doing it.
Shield the baby from the screen.
I have a confession to make. I was for a long time really on the fence on the Goodfellas versus the Godfather debate as to like what's the greatest mob movie of all time. And I recently rewatched all three Godfathers, and I don't think it's actually close. That Goodfellas is like definitely the one.
I feel like Goodfellas. I mean, Godfather is like that movie for like the generation older, and then this generation more so Goodfellas. About Shield and the Baby. Oh, sorry, what were you saying, Julia?
Oh, no, I just love The Godfather. That's all.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, obviously, it's a great movie. About Shield in Your Eyes, I did before my kid had as much consciousness as she. I could not do this now because now we just watch Gabby Dollhouse, but that damn show. But when she was like 4 months old, I never actually saw The Sopranos until like 2 years ago. I just watched the whole thing on Max.
Yeah,
she watched it with me. She was sleeping through most of it, and I tried to not have her watch. Have the head toward it. But it wasn't Goodfellas, but it was like pretty gritty stuff, and I could see why everyone loves it. That's a 1999 show, and I've been meaning to watch it for like 15 years. So finally got around to it.
For this podcast, I was watching Julie Taymor's Titus in the nursery and just like trying to angle the screen just right so like it wasn't in her field of vision.
How old is she?
She's 10 weeks.
Oh, she's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Ross, before we go, where can people find you and your work and order your book and all that stuff?
Sure thing. So just go to rossbenish.com and you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And the book is really available on any website where books are sold. Bookshop.org is a great place to buy books if you are unsure where to get them.
And if you don't want to support certain people for certain reasons right now. Cool. Ross, thanks for joining us. Would love to have you back sometime, maybe sometime after the movie. The book comes out, you can come back and do a different movie with us. We still have a ton that we have not covered. Julia, got anything to say before we leave?
Yeah, no, just Dwayne Johnson 2028.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. We could do a lot worse.
Thanks, Ross. And look out for frogs. We'll see you next time.
Move to the music, play like music, move it to the music, yeah.